It's very nice to be here and to share some thought today. I'm going to be sharing some thoughts about some projects that I've done over the past few years. And just a little thing to start with, it got me thinking just then that we haven't really spoken about objects or things, and so I think that I'll be turning some attention towards the things that we make, if indeed they turn into things. And I'm going to be talking a lot about a project that I was asked to work on in 2007 called Making a Slow Revolution. And at the time I'd been working on some related projects that were building up towards this project in a way. I'd been working on a project called Carry the Can, which was about value and sustainability in the metal arena. I trained in making in metal predominantly. I have to say, after some of the conversations we've heard over the past 2 days, I'm not sure about the ideas of professionalism, but this is something that I've done all my life and for a very long time, and the people that I'm going to talk about today have also done that. So from school onwards, I've been making. And I went through quite a long education in making and have continued to make since then. I suppose I've worked in academia, but I don't anymore particularly. I do the odd day here and there, but I made a conscious decision to work by myself and to sort of rove around and go in and out of that sort of situation. And there's some particular reasons for that as well. And I've been working before the Making a Slow Revolution project on a project called Process Works, which was about process. And I guess over the years, in a very reflective way, I've realised that my work's really about process and a back and forward approach to working in a very reflective way. I'm actually going to read today from my paper. I've had to really think quite hard about this project. The last talk that I gave specifically about taking time was in 2011, so almost 2 years ago. And when I give talks, I give quite a lot of talks, I often talk about it within the context of other work that I'm doing. But today I want to really think in hindsight, back through some of the projects I've done since Taking Time. Taking Time was a project that I was asked to co-curate with somebody called Andy Horn, who is the exhibition manager at Birmingham City Museum. And he came to me with an idea of a project. And so I was given this idea, and we came up with this title, Making a Slow Revolution. And there's a blog that is no longer really working, but it was a blog that we used from 2007 to build up ideas. And this blog and the ideas became this exhibition, Taking Time. And so when we began the blog, we didn't know that it would be an exhibition, but this is what it became. And so I'm going to try and reflect on some of that now with hindsight. This is the blog. It's still operational, and there's a lot of material on there if you want to read it. And just quickly, I'm going to tell you about some of the things that have happened to me since that time, because I'm going to be talking today with that hindsight of doing other projects since Taking Time. And I think that's really informed me and where I am now, and I think hindsight's an important thing, and I think we've heard a lot of hindsight over the past couple of days too, that, you know, we're looking back at stuff from the position we're in now. So how I felt about this now is quite different to how I feel now, how I felt then. And I think in some senses, if you take the idea of slowness, which is related to, it came from ideas from the slow food movement, you could say that that's about a social thing. But what I've tried to unpick somehow through other projects is what I really think is important here to do with social change. And it might not be the slogan, slow. I thought it was very interesting yesterday that on the one hand, Sarah talked about a slowing down of making, and then Katie, in her talk about fine cell work, talked about a speeding up for people working in their prison cells. And for me, it's a very difficult term to say it's all about slow, because obviously making's not all about being slow. It could be about fast and slow. And so this was a project that I did in Moscow. As you can see, quick, quick, slow, we were talking about the ideas between quick and slow, and that maybe they're very close together somehow. And in between, in the past few years as well, I've done a lot of projects. I'm a maker, I make objects as well as working with lots of other people and thinking about place, process, why we make stuff. And actually, I've got into a position of being really quite reflective about the importance of making and what's that doing to you in terms of thinking, how it helps you to develop thinking. And I've done a lot of walking projects, thinking about place, thinking about making, thinking about things falling into disrepair, and being brought into existence somehow, being remade and rethought in our culture. And that's why I called my talk Mantling and Dismantling. I think I'm very interested in, as you make an object, you may be putting something together but taking apart at the same time. And I think I'm interested in that as a making process and a thinking process, so going back and forward in this reflective way. And I've worked, I like working with other people a lot, although I have a studio and work there by myself quite often. I also go out and work with other people, and one of the projects that I've worked with is called Intelligent Trouble. It's a group of makers that change over time, and we work together, swapping work and making pieces of work together. And we've also collected stories along the way, so we've got lots of stories of people's thoughts about objects and making. And I also, 2 years ago, worked in Berlin for 4 months, where I ran a walking project with a group of students. We didn't walk for 4 months, but we did a lot of walking. The whole thing was constructed around walking. And it actually meant that I could take the students outside of the sort of institution of their college and think about a city and the nature of a changing place, which obviously Berlin is obviously that place of major change. And then most recently, over the past year, I've been working with a dancer and the Siobhan Davis Dance Company on a project called Side by Side. And this is very open-ended. It's about process, and it's about working next to someone and with them and thinking about maybe what's happening in that process. And actually, it's at this stage now that I've really started to think about what that means as a maker. Leila Diallo, who I'm working with here, is a dancer and choreographer, and she describes herself also as a maker, and there's a lot of process between us that we can share. And a lot of that process for me, I've discovered, is about moving around and what that means in terms of thinking. And some of that came up again yesterday about this idea of moving around, not just the hands, but the whole body. So anyway, I'm going to focus on a process-led approach to these projects today, which I might liken to Mikhail Bakhtin's dialogic approach in literature, where there's a continual dialogue with other works and other makers. It does not merely answer, correct, silence, or extend a previous work, but informs and is continually informed by the previous work. In the words of textile artist Shelley Goldsmith, through the process of unpicking, I become very intimate with that piece of cloth, and it allows me to listen to the memory that was built up over many, many years. And I'm going to attempt to do the same thing, to unpick some thinking about process, and to ask the question, is a paradigm shift needed in thinking about the importance of craft and making in order to understand what's really important about it? It's clearly not about a word, I think. And I'm going to do this somewhat, as I've said, by drawing on the project taking time. So I'm going to be delving back through, with hindsight, from some of the projects I've just shown you, and through this project too that I curated in 2010 for the online artist database Axis. And that was a very interesting process because it was all online, and my work really is about objects and our relationship to objects and how we can understand through those. And so choosing the work online was quite an interesting process. But I brought together 6 people in this curated exhibition called Making and Unmaking, Repair and Repetition. And I think through my talk now, I'm going to pick up on some of those ideas of making and unmaking, repair and repetition. So these are some of the words that were very important in the Taking Time project. Sustainability, distinctiveness, reflecting, engaging, participating, appropriateness, virtual networks, strings, iteration, terroir. There were loads of things that we were looking at. And we opened up the project and process and asked people to join us in thinking about it in this blog. So I'm going to try and get across what this project really has to do with social change. And I don't think it's an obvious one in a way, although all the slogans around it, the slow and the making a slow revolution, sound as if they're about that. And our intention was to think socially. I remember one of the things Andy said to me, and sorry Andy if I've remembered this wrongly, but was that we weren't really looking at political things. At the time I've done quite a lot of work in America, and I was thinking about some of the people that we could work with from America, thinking about political ideas, but he wanted a more gentle kind of way into this. And now looking back, I understand some of that and perhaps why that was. And you've probably realised I don't think this is about slogans or banners. And I feel like in some ways I find it difficult to use the word craft to talk about it, as it's really quite a corrupted term now. It's used in such a wash of undefined ways, from home decor to the production of jeans and beer and coffee. And you know, it doesn't really do justice to some of the working processes, I think, that go on. So when you see an ad, I just saw an ad for Levi's jeans, which includes the word craft. It's quite difficult to rationalise that with some of what I'm going to talk about, I think. So the term slow design was given to me, and I also find the word, maybe I just have a problem with words, but I also find the word slow quite difficult. It was given to me by Andy Horn. And he was thinking about the relationship between the burgeoning slow food movement, which had emerged in Italy in the 1980s, and philosophies from the arts and crafts movement, as well as ideas about minimalism. He was very interested in minimalism in art and craft. So when thinking about slow design philosophies and the project, we were never far away from thinking about artists and makers whose work really dealt with place, process, value, and local identity. We were not necessarily looking at ideas about slowing down physically or doing things slowly or the length of time that something might take. They might have come into it, but that wasn't the focus. But we were thinking about being aware, going through the process of making, and noticing and highlighting some things about the making process that may usually go unnoticed. In this respect, we were and are interested in the process as something, not just its outcome or end product, but the process of it. And Paul Harper's here today. He's going to be having a conversation with us in a little while. And Paul, during the blog part of the project, we had several different projects going on within that, and one of them was called A Summer Season of Discussion, where we asked people to actually write some things. And this is one of the things that Paul said in July 2008. I think that one of the exciting things about your project is precisely that it shifts the critical sense away from the autonomous art object and onto the continuity of experience in which art becomes, as Dewey said, prefigured in the very processes of living. But it's interesting that, you know, today I started to think more just by listening about objects again and how they're so closely related to what I do and never far away, but I just see them as part of the process, not an end point of the process. And again, it's Paul that helped me to think about that in the Process Works exhibition that I did. I was always struggling with this idea that as a crafts maker of objects, the final thing and the thing that represented me was an object. And Paul gave me the term resting point, which was great, that these things maybe were resting points in thinking and that something else happened around them. You know, you might make something and it goes out into the world, but it's a resting point from where you continue the rest of your work or reflect back. And I've just got a few pictures of studios because I think I'm going to reflect a little bit about the importance of things that are underlying the objects and the people that you see, the things that are behind the process. So living in a world where the domestic product of any nation is only ever measured in monetary terms, we have to deal with the obsession of outcome and end product all the time. Only in the past few weeks, the DCMS have suggested that the crafts is removed from the list of UK's cultural industries. The suggestion is that the crafts have more to do with manufacturing and less with creativity and should be removed. But if you look further into this, you find that it's been arrived at through a series of metric, which are counting analysis, based on outcome rather than process. And so it's no surprise that the outcome of the research is less than satisfactory to many of us and will perhaps have severe repercussions for the areas we're talking about here today. But going back to taking time, I'm firstly going to draw on some words from Jane Webb, who wrote a report on the project in 2012. And this project, again in hindsight, has been really important to my thinking about the project and its meaning, and its meaning in terms of social change as well. And I'm going to pull out some of the essence of the exhibition and what its process has successfully achieved. And then I'm going to focus in on several artists in the exhibition. I'm going to pick out 3 artists and their work from the exhibition and other work that they make and how they work. And then talk about 2 other artists in the exhibition and their work and how that worked within the exhibition. And I'm going to talk about how they've navigated ideas of changing thinking and practice about making and manufacturing, and what objects are for in this process-led way. What I'd like to focus on is all of their in-depth knowledge of their fields, which has been developed in each through educations in design and making. So all the people I'm going to talk about have, like me, concentrated on the subject since school really, and trained in many different ways, but it's been a life thing. And they've all pursued this creatively and critically in what I would term, and for me, the Slow project, I began to realise was about a sort of long thinking process, or long making model. Thinking that's not about ticking off outcomes and moving on, but rather based on projects that link and thread back and forward over time, tying together thinking that can be shared and developed. So I think in Jane Webb's words, the project, so I'm going to quote a little bit from this report that was written by Jane Webb. She said, the project intended to break down the divisions of process and object, which was for the makers and their other contributors to taking time, an essential element communicated by the objects that they did produce. In their resulting work for this project, it seemed to me at the time of review that the split between process and finished object was intentionally unresolved. And I think this sort of state of being unresolved is really quite important, that something can be open-ended, that we don't have to answer the question. And I think Webb's picking up on some of the most vital aspects of the project, of making, thinking, time passing and talk, and what it is to be a dedicated maker who links ideas together with others and thinks about how they fit into society at large today. But she goes on to say, importantly in taking time, this muddying of process and object was not reliant on the traditional understanding of an organic relationship between crafted and crafting, where the metaphorical thumbprint remains romantically visible and there's a mystical connection between maker's intention and object. And from the beginning of the project, it was the intention that all could be involved in the process of constructing ideas around the project. And again, Webb's commented, it was because the makers were critically engaged in questioning the nature of the object, of craft and society. As such, their work left open an unfinished space by which to maintain the connection between thing, analysis, and question. In the resulting objects, looking back now, I realised just how important this is. And the blog was trying to put together an exhibition of this kind, this open-ended thing where you could think about not only the objects that you saw within the exhibition, but something underlying that too. And it's through a specific emphasis in the discussion that this is possible. This is the discussion on the blog, which was the idea that the objects in the exhibition were derived from an establishing of a particular form of dialogue through the blog and early conversation. It notes that through exploring the narratives created via discussions and their focus on the description of studio spaces, it then considers some of the work for taking time itself as that created with an emphasis on retaining a relationship with not only its process of construction, but also with the site of construction. So the relationship, and that's why I showed you some images of workshops, the relationship with the workshop and the things that are going on, the objects there. We were trying to think about that relationship, and I think if you want to read the blog, there are some lovely pieces in there, and also there's audio too of conversations about this relationship. And what Webb picked out was that people involved in the project would always draw back through thinking about the spaces and places of their work. So finally, it's in this instant that the objects are a gathering place or a matter of concern, created through repeated time spent in a site of making, and this results in a particular type of open-ended object. So the objects again, they're probably not cited for me in being finished objects in one way, because they are also very open to questions, so they're more open-ended in that sense. And the objects themselves retain a perpetual link to their sites of origin because they are not objects as matter of fact or closed finished pieces, but are matters of concern, objects that are perpetually remade and remain open to change. And I will go on to talk and illustrate that now so that you can see what I'm trying to say. It might sound quite complicated, I think, some of this trying to unpick what the sites of practice mean in terms of an exhibition. And it's quite open-ended thinking, I must say, that I'm trying to go through now. It's something that I'm thinking about how an exhibition maybe operates as a site to think through process. So when the exhibition was first installed for the first time in October 2009 at Birmingham City Art Gallery, and it became an entity in itself, I remember being struck by an overwhelming feeling of time stopping, that the thinking over a period of 2 years was suddenly embodied by the objects selected within a space of time. And effectively, this was now concrete. So I didn't walk in, we set up the exhibition, and suddenly the thinking became concrete. And it was a bit of a scary thing. I must admit, I didn't feel completely comfortable with this, because suddenly this process-led approach of thinking and talking and debating suddenly became this concrete thing. It's almost like saying, this is what it is, this is what we mean, and this is how we see it. And yet that was just a sort of snapshot in time. So it's difficult to say. It was a difficult thing to deal with at the time in a way, but that passed quite swiftly, I have to say. And as this first installation drew to a close and the feelings of concretion played in and out of my mind, I was taken back to a recorded conversation I had had several weeks before with the oral historian Dr. Linda Sandino about my experience of curation. During this, Sandino drew on the narrative metaphors I used to describe the project, the lines, threads, and times and space. She described this as a chronotope, which is another Bakhtinian device, whilst observing the layering and a flexible form which is not just linear, but perhaps a web. And I'll show you some images that also illustrate this in a minute. So emerging was an interconnected web that offered space for thinking through concepts of time. The literal threads in the exhibition seem to have a connection through space and time, place and person, to both literal and metaphorical webs in localized and a globalized sense, a kind of Ethernet and internet connecting through objects, words, people and actions. And it's these connections that have been so powerful, back and forward through time and space, from the local, that have been forged through talk and developing ideas, to the wider links made through the web, to the connections found in the objects and associations elicited through making in the gallery space and recorded or fed back through other works. There was an intertwining that's come into view, and it led to a project that sort of existed, I think, in multiple time frames and spaces. The sensation of succession and so duration imbues human experience, providing it with a unique character. We're able to compare the present held in memory with the present as currently experienced. And this sense of succession and duration and sequence embodied here is also where there's a slowness or slowing down for me. Perhaps it's like a stop frame animation or a piece of minimalist music. Voices and ideas layered through time and space, but cut and spliced, mixed and melded in complex ways, so utterly in time and yet at the same time out of time. So I'm going to now talk about several of the artists. I'm sorry, I probably should show you some images. So the first artist I'm going to talk about is Neil Brownsword. And in Neil's work, I think it's hard to remove yourself from the sensation of succession and connection. He's a ceramic artist and a practice-based researcher who lives and works in Stoke-on-Trent, the city where he grew up. Neil was actually apprenticed at Wedgwood at the age of 16, and Wedgwood, the ceramics factory in Stoke-on-Trent, went into administration while we were working on the Taking Time project, so it was very poignant. Generations of Neil's family worked at the Wedgwood factory. But Neil went on to go and study right up to PhD level. As Brownsword says, one of my earliest creative recollections is associated with being drawn to the innate plastic properties of clays, dug from woodland behind my parents' house in North Staffordshire. Awareness of the major presence of ceramic manufacture was further reinforced by growing up in a surrounding landscape that bears the scars of hundreds of years of industrial activity. The ongoing and critical dialogue between his work and the greater industry through his material practice shows a deep connection to making a meaning over time and in place, defining and redefining through generations of material and making experience, conveying the loss of an industry that he and his family worked in, whilst offering something new, profound and enlightening in turn. Brownsword's work remained ongoing after the exhibition had opened. And this is some of his work. His work, I don't know if you know it, is basically a reinterpretation of found objects, objects that have been left over from the detritus of the ceramic industry. So in his work you often see the moulds. He's using moulds, 17th, 18th century moulds from the industry. He uses kiln detritus to build up on things, and all sorts of things that he's dug up from his garden and from around the area. So in a sense, he gives new life to these objects, but I think new meaning in this layering process and building process, thinking about what this decline and industry renewal of thinking means to a place. In the exhibition, his work changed over time. He made, I think for me it was interesting working with other makers on the project. I knew that it wasn't always easy to complete a piece of work in a given time frame as well, and so some of the works changed over time, but this also added something interesting to the exhibition. But I think what, for me, Neil's work is clearly, it's a process based in dialogic narratives. There are voices from different times, standpoints and places coming together as the central underpinning of these remarkable objects that he makes. And I'm sure, I mean, I think that Anne was actually bringing up some of the ideas of tension, and I think, you know, there must be tension somehow in the work that he makes, and in the community there, which has been in great decline. And what does this mean to the industry? What does it mean to the workers that worked at Wedgwood? How is that being redefined? And I think in some ways you might liken Brownsword's work to a form of regeneration. He's made a connection between the cyclical nature of prosperity and decline. And most recently he's been involved in the development of the Stoke Ceramic Biennale, worked in situations, live situations, for example, in his Marlhole project where a group of artists worked at a local clay pit. Joran Vieterberg was telling me yesterday, because Neil's also a professor at Bergen, that they're working on projects in Stoke, thinking again about this reinvention of what the local industry can be, and how that works now in a different way, and how it can offer some sort of regeneration. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Stoke-on-Trent, but it's a very depressed area, and even its ceramic museum, which is fantastic, has had difficulties in the past few years, and is not always open anymore. So that there's a lot of difficulty there. So I think Neil offers something from that. And this sometimes metaphorical and narrative focus when designing objects and working with or repurposing found or discarded materials in order to develop more layered narratives and meanings is the subject of David Gates's work. In the exhibition, Gates, a furniture designer and maker, uses the remnants of larger pieces of functional work and reclaims the industrial raw whiteware material of thrown-away fridges found on the streets of his native South London to create ambiguous objects that ask you to question the very notion and purpose of furniture in our own lives. Chair, table, ironing board, instrument or architecture. We see familiar materials, insides and outsides, tops and legs, ways of putting things together, perhaps the dovetails. This relational aspect brings the viewer's interpretation into the process of the object, finding meaning in its social life beyond the workshop, bringing forth remembrance and prompting possibilities in the imagination, fusing the past and future and the now. The work comes from furniture, but can sit in our minds and in our spaces in many other ways. Those are Gates's words. His work for the exhibition not only firmly referenced his other work as a designer of functional furniture, but his research work which questions the nature of the history of the crafts as a genre, and one which has tended to rely on grand narratives. His focus is on a somewhat missing part, the small stories, the stories of makers and how they construct meaning in what they do. And again, he's making an ongoing reference to what it is that people are doing in their work and how this contributes widely to thought. And I'm just going to read a little thing that David wrote. And I suppose now, you know, we have, there's often a lot of furniture that's not required anymore. If you live in a city like London, people live in such small houses now that there's a lot of requirement of say, dining furniture that's not needed anymore. And I think Neil also looked at that. You know, he looked at the decline of it, or he's looked at the decline of industry. Factories like Wedgwood, who were producing dinner services that we no longer require in our modern lives, and I think furniture has had the same kind of change as well. And so what does the making of furniture offer in other ways? So these are David's words. Words around chairs play with power and position. Chairman, cathedra, the electric chair and throne. singular and only space for the one. Tables have a chance to be more egalitarian in their lives. Families and friends, lovers or colleagues around them, talk and live. Brought together for a moment, the complexities of the invisible traces above and around the surface, drawing together and negotiating. The spaces underneath, colonised by children in a parallel world of imaginative play. We bring something to the table, we confer in the boardroom, talk in the canteen, meetings happen across them, from the boardroom to family dinners, working talk at the desk, lovers' trysts on the phone, face to face and in the ether. Thoughts are spun and plots are hatched. At the workbench, stories and knowledge are shared and traded over the surface of saw cuts, tea stains, scratched names, crayons and wine spilt, initials carved, stories written, woven back and forth over tables and through time itself. And for the exhibition, Rebecca Early brought together a visual digital sketchbook which was made from the sifting back through of 10 years of her work and revisiting the process of her Top 100 project. This is Becky in her studio in London. In doing so, she revisited memories, other projects she met through its course, and realised the enormity of staying with such an endeavour. And I interviewed Early about the process before the exhibition opened. So I interviewed her in 2009. And having begun our careers at the same time in 1994, we'd stayed and met up a lot along the way. And we talked through the project and life events over that 10-year period. It clarified the scale of this piece of work that she's been working on, which has continued since, and its process and contribution to thinking that Early's made through it. And since the exhibition, Early's gone on to work with the Swedish research project Mistra, Future Fashion, and has developed the TED's 10 toolbox and other schemes which are delivered to companies such as Hennes. And the schemes that she works on are about sustainability and how we can redesign ways of working. And really, when I spoke to her about this 10-year period, and you can find actually the project online, it's this upcycling textiles website. And it charts this 10-year period that we were discussing. And it was very interesting to hear what that meant to how her thought had developed over time. And then for me now to reconnect with her and think back at what's happened since the exhibition and actually how her ideas have finally, or not just her ideas because she also works with groups of people, but her ideas have become part of policy level in government practice about design. And I'm just going to read a little bit from this interview or this conversation that we had. I asked her in 2008 about the project and whether she thought it would turn into such a long journey. And I'll read a little bit of that now. She said, "No, of course not, but I know when I started to think consciously about it, and that was when I was doing the boudoir shirts." I think I showed her in picking out some boudoir shirts here. For some time, I'd realised that polyester clothing would be a good thing for me to play with, and I started to collect pieces from charity shops. I'm wearing one of the pieces today, I should say, from one of, you can see her making this piece actually. It was a solution or several solutions. It was about recycling, which I was really into, but it was also about pattern cutting. It meant that I didn't have to work with a pattern cutter and factories to make my clothes. Then whilst at the Eden project, I started collecting shirts from the local charity shops down there. I was really enjoying the difference between what I was finding down there and what I was finding in London charity shops, and I realised about a regional difference. But I began to see that many women wore size 14 polyester shirts from M&S. So I think one of her thoughts at that time, or through sifting back, looking back at this, was that could they work with M&S in the future, Marks and Spencer's, to think about recycling these polyester shirts. So I am wearing size 14 M&S polyester shirt that's been recut and printed in one of her, this iteration, so the template shirt. And so her 10 years have been investigating using different technologies to remake works, but to also think back and forward about what this means. And now I think the biggest step, I haven't seen Becky for a while because she's so busy, but the biggest step now is taking that into bigger industry and the impact that can make at industry level, which has been immense. So working with designers who are working for large fashion and textile retail companies and getting them to rethink how they can make in the future. I went on to ask her, in terms of time period, what I see as such a huge aspect of the project, the time frames, and that you've gone through so many time frames. You've talked about styles, you've talked about your life process. Did you realise at the boudoir point, which was one of the first points where she was buying pieces from charity shops to remake, just how significant the project was or is? Or is it just in reflection that you could see how important this was? And she said, I knew I'd created a framework for myself, and I think we talked about frameworks somewhere yesterday, that was going to be really useful to me to continue to be creative, but I didn't realise that the idea would come together in such a way. And I suppose this is for me as well, this idea of hindsight. It's only looking back that you maybe realise the importance of these things. And I think she's a very interesting person to think about, and how she really has kept this project going and really been able to link the ideas together and sustain a very long period of thinking and to make impact through that thinking. So finally I'm going to talk about two, I say finally, but I've got a bit more to talk about, but I'm going to talk about two examples in the exhibition that demonstrate a perpetual making and unmaking and remaking process. So Shane Waltner was considering relational and participatory aspects of his working practice through an installation in the gallery. And in Garland 21, Waltner installed the beginnings of a large audience-driven piece of work at the opening of the exhibition in Birmingham. And these are the sketches that he put together with the dancer Cheryl McChesney-Jones, because they were going to begin this process of an installation of woolen threads through a dance. And so at the opening of Taking Time, this dance took place with local school children. And they began the process of installing threads. The threads had been donated to us by the manufacturing company Brinton's Carpets, so they're all the leftovers of all their carpet manufacturing. And basically through the dance, they set up a very loose installation of threads that the public were then invited to add to. And visitors to the exhibition spent long periods in the gallery space. At Birmingham City Gallery, it was installed there for 3 months, and I would visit the exhibition weekly, often going to give talks or just to visit to see what was going on. And I spoke about this idea of concretion when I'd been involved in installing the exhibition, and walked away and felt difficult about that concretion. And yet after the dance, and when I visited the gallery the next day after the opening, that changed immediately, because somebody had already been in and knitted. One of the comments from the gallery, there was gallery guards, people that were in the exhibition and in looking after it, and they worked for the museum, but the museum always gets its staff very involved. And in this particular case, these people in the gallery looking after the exhibition got very involved in this piece, so I would often go in and they'd be knitting away. They also got involved in sharing this with the public, so showing them how to knit if they didn't know how to knit, or sharing sharing stories about how they remembered knitting in their lives. And they said that in general, people stayed in the gallery for much longer. You know, people would visit the exhibition and maybe stay for 2 or 3 hours, when normally it would be 15 minutes, half an hour visits, but they would stay much longer. And it always made me laugh because, you know, I'd go in and somebody would have knitted a hat, or so this whole thing turned into this huge installation. There'd be hats, scarves, so you knew that people had been there for a long time. And I heard some very lovely stories as well from the guards, who would tell me when I went in what had happened. You know, they'd have these stories to share. For example, a lovely story about a woman who just dropped her son off at university, and he was leaving home, and she felt very sad and didn't know the exhibition was on, but walked past the gallery and just saw something going on and went in and knitted with some of the people in there. But what was interesting about this piece and how it developed, and then how it changed, actually I could show you tons of slides of this, and how it changed through venues, because in here it was a very horizontal piece and spread out like a web, which was almost the size of this room. And in other places it had to become much more linear and fit vertically along a wall. But it was interesting how it was always engaged with by the public, with no instructions really. The only thing there again were objects. So the only thing that lent itself to people knowing what to do was what was there, what remained there, and also the knitting needles and the wool that was there. So that was enough to indicate what that was about. But what I found really interesting, especially at Birmingham, but in other venues too, that was often placed in near proximity in the exhibition to Walkner's work, was Amy Houghton's interactive installation, 1 centimetre is a little less than half an inch, which took a pseudo-forensic approach to understanding a piece of historical text. Taking apart and x-raying a letter sourced from the Dovecot Studios. So one of the venues along the way was the Dovecot Studios in Edinburgh, and it's a tapestry studio with gallery, and their archive is held on the Isle of Bute. And in the exhibition, we commissioned a lot of the artists to make specific pieces of work for the exhibition, and Amy decided to go to the Isle of Bute and look at the archive. And she began to x-ray these letters, and she found some amazing scripts about the lives of some of the weavers that had worked on tapestries for years and years. And she investigated some of the tapestries and how you could see when somebody had changed. So somebody would be working on these for 7 years, and then you could see how something changed about the hand. And you can notice, especially over the war period during the First World War, when the makers changed, because a lot of the men had to go and fight in the war, and so they were taken out of the process for some time. But Amy made this piece, and she wanted to understand something about the person who wrote these things. They were writing about their daily lives. They were writing about the process of making the tapestries, but they were also writing about the things going on around them and around the studios. And she noted, you know, they were talking about birds and the landscape and things going on around them. And she wanted to think about what it was like to take something apart, both physically and metaphorically. She says, "I like the idea of going backwards, the unmaking. In going backwards, you have the sense of what the person has been through. At points, you'll see things that only that person would have seen at the time of making, and there's a real sense of physical connection." So she really felt that through looking at this, she could understand and unpick something about the person that had written it. She made a stop frame animation of this piece of script, and in order to do that, she had to scrub out the letters on it. So she went through this backwards of undoing the written text. But it's through the public interaction with the installation that yet another layering occurred. Amy made this stop frame animation into this piece. It's very dark here, but this is Deirdre sitting at a typewriter, and the animation was attached to a typewriter. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a sec, but it's through the public interaction with her installation that yet another layering process has occurred, through the poems, letters and thoughts left on its 1920s typewriter and gathered through the exhibition. You would be able to sit at this typewriter and type your thoughts about the exhibition, and whilst you did that, the animation kind of draws away, so it unmakes the writing as you're typing. And again, I'm going to reflect on something that Jane Webb, I don't know how well you can see this, but you can read this piece behind me. This is a piece that was left on the typewriter. But Jane Webb, again, reflected on this piece of work in her report. And this, again, was a really important piece for me in visiting the exhibition, because I felt that we had contact with the people that were going to the exhibition and what it meant to them in a very profound way. The process of asking people to type a message on a historic machine and these small cards of text became important ways in which Helen, Craftspace and Amy herself and the contributing artists were able to see the impact of their work in a more profound way. In a blog entry early after the show opened in Birmingham, a type card was selected, it's this type card, by Helen to represent the feedback already being received from the public. Like many of the type cards, it featured comments on the experience of typing and its relationship to memory, the memory of making in the writer's own family and the family situation in the present. Amy's work is then discussed in a later conversation session at Birmingham Waterhall and provided the inspiration for a feedback session for the participants that's documented on the blog. From all the exhibition venues, Amy has retained the cards and filed them under headings such as writing, time, industrial revolution, handmade, comments on exhibition, experiences and memories, current affairs and conversation, all of which echo the debates of the Taking Time community before the exhibition opened. It's this process of making life and communication that people write about rather than the objects. These thoughts animate Amy's work in a continual unmaking as the typing erases the archival document on the screen and remaking through the writer's manuscripts of memories and comment. This is a quote from Ava Hoffman in her book called Time. Both mind and the psyche require internality. In order to reflect on a problem or build an argument, we need to turn mental attention inwards, to mull over ideas and let the mind wander, to sift the important from the trivial, to follow thoughts in their course and consider the disjunctions and connections between them. I think it's this importance of internality balanced with a deep external understanding of our world and both local and global conditions encountered that these projects have aimed to reveal, where through making connections and having space for deeply reflective periods of time that a time change appears to take place. Here a fast becomes slow and slow becomes fast, and stepping out of a known time and entering another time is tangible. And in 2010, I told you that I curated an exhibition called Making, Unmaking, Repair and Repetition. And in it I said, repair in making is complex. It takes the understanding of how something has been made by its original maker to then repair or restore it. The making and unmaking process that takes place in order to do this involves a layering of knowledge and sensibility in the handling of material that develops through time spent and appreciation of changing technologies over time. And in Richard Sennett's latest book, Together, he writes of repair. He uses the idea of different types of repair, of restoration, remediation and reconfiguration. He draws on the David Chipperfield reconfiguration of the Neues Museum in Berlin and how his approach to making has resulted in a building that, quote, conveys an ethical message about damage and repair. The reconfiguration of the building provides a guiding metaphor in thinking about how to repair cooperation. I don't know if any of you know, this is just in contrast, because again, I'm interested in the tensions, that there's always an opposite as well, that the planning application for Chipperfield's new extension at the Jeffrey Museum in London has just been turned down, and that's because of a local objection to having an old pub torn down to put that in its place. So I think there's always a tension between trying to look at these things, and there isn't always one side to a story, there's always another, which I think, again, in this back and forward way, makes us understand things. So the artists I've drawn on today show a deep understanding of their craft through process-driven working practices. Their works reconfigure and restitch, thinking back and forward. I think that it's this process-driven approach that should concern us in terms of social change. What if we were more concerned with how things fitted together in the world today, and less concerned as craft as a product or commodity? And I have to ask, I mean, this may be controversial, but I have to ask the question, how does what we're talking about here relate to Collect, which is the event that's taking place at the moment in London, and why many of us are gathered here? It seems to me that Collect's become about one definable aspect of craft, its sale, which I'm sure is nonetheless important to many of us, and sometimes attention, I'm sure, when you're thinking about these process-driven ways of working. But there is always an object, and that's a major part of it. But I think it's how that's thought about out of context with this that I find problematic. I have to note that none of the artists I've spoken about are showing their work at Collect, and nor am I this year. And I wonder how we fit into the format now, or the discussions around that. And in her essay, Craft in Action, of which I'm sorry I don't have the date, by Tanya Harrod, she commented, "Why has craft been commodified? After all, in the late 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, craft and applied art activity was seen as a way of expressing ambivalence towards bourgeois industrial society." And I definitely say that I have a growing ambivalence to some of these thoughts, and I have to say to the word craft, I said it before, and it's quite problematic about how it's used. I'm not saying that it has to be protected, but it makes it difficult to define some of the works that we're looking at here. And I don't want to get into any of the art-craft debate, which I think is old as well, but we originally I'm just going to finish on a little thing about why we started with the blog being called Making a Slow Revolution. We were thinking about ideas of revolution and change, but we also were thinking about the fact that the craft seems to slowly turn around some of the same discussions again and again, and so things seem to revolve around. And so I'd just like to end with saying maybe there needs to be some new discussion, and perhaps that's something we can talk about today. And I think it's, for me, about the linking up of thinking in many different ways, and the way that these artists and makers have really thought in their work about this sort of web-like approach to thinking and making. Thank you.